Hello there, dear Junior 6 students, and welcome back to our last Oliver Twist video. Last time we discussed the events of Chapter 9 of Oliver Twist. Let me remind you of these events very quickly. Nancy takes Oliver to Bill Sykes' house, and Sykes threatens Oliver to work with him. Sykes takes Oliver and meets Toby Crackit. They go to the house at Chertsey to rob it. Sykes tells Oliver to open the door of the house for them. Of course, you know that Oliver would get through a small window into the house. The people in the house wake up by the noise made by Oliver when he drops his lamp. Oliver is shot by one of the servants, and Sykes and Toby run away. Oliver is left lying on the cold, wet ground. So, this was basically what happens in chapter 9 of Oliver Twist. Today, we are going to cover chapter 10, which is the last chapter you are responsible for this term. But before we proceed to discussing the events of chapter 10, I want you to go to your readers, read chapter 10 of Oliver Twist, and on the CD you can find the two tracks reading this chapter, chapter 10A and chapter 10B. I want you to listen to them and read the chapter. Okay, now that I suppose that you have done what I asked you to do, let's move on to discussing the summary of this chapter. In the morning, Oliver wakes in pain. He decides to drag himself to the house. He reaches the gate, knocks at the door, and faints. The servants open the door and recognize him as one of the thieves. Mr. Giles tells Miss Rose, a young lady, that he has shot this boy because he is one of the thieves. After speaking to her aunt, Mrs. Maylie, she tells the servants to carry Oliver to Mr. Giles' room and bring a doctor. Mr. Giles is one of the servants, and he is the one who has shot Oliver the night before. Rose and Mrs. Maylie take good care of Oliver. Dr. Losborn arrives and examines Oliver. Oliver stays ill for weeks, but he gets better at the end. Oliver he leaves with Rose and Mrs. Maylie from this house to another house in the countryside. Oliver learns to read and write. He goes for walks with Rose and Mrs. Maylie. He helps in the garden, feeds the birds, and lives happily with them. So Oliver now finds a good home and good people who treat him kindly. Of course, he didn't find this with Fagin, his gang, and Mr. Bumble, the workhouse. We can say that Oliver had a very, very difficult childhood, but now he is with a very good family that takes care of him. Okay, this brings us to the end of chapter 10. It's quite short. And now we are going to look at the important quote in this chapter. Okay, it says, "Oh, aunt, dear aunt, don't let them take this sick child to prison." You will find this quote on page 44 of Oliver Twist. Who says this? Exactly, it's Rose. So Rose says these words to her aunt, Mrs. Maylie, in Mrs. Maylie's house. Rose and Mrs. Maylie feel pity for Oliver. Rose asks her aunt not to tell the police that Oliver is a thief. Mrs. Maylie agrees and they take good care of Oliver. So this again brings us to the end of chapter 10 of Oliver Twist. You are responsible only for the first 10 chapters of this reader, but I advise you to continue reading it. You will enjoy it very much. And at some point, inshallah, in the future, I really, really advise you to read the whole thing or the original literary work, which is quite longer than this one. Uh, Okay, if you have any questions on Oliver Twist, please don't hesitate to bring them to school. Thank you so much for watching and see you at school.